Warmly welcome to Linköping University and to the Department of Technical Studies. And we are TMA Technology and Social Change. And so welcome to you in the room, but also to the people online. And my name is Karin Edberg, and I will just introduce the speaker of today, Mimi Sheller. So this is the first week of the autumn semester, and it was kind of hard to get a good lecture room. But hopefully the setting will be good enough for all of us online and here. We are here today for the first occasion of the International Lecture Series in Planning for Transition for the autumn 2024. So, but the whole year of 2024, we have a special focus on sustainable mobilities. And we have had a number of distinguished guests already during the spring, as you can see on the first slide here. And all these previous lectures are available online as well. And coming up next is Peter Cox, that will talk about cycling towards degrowth on September 19th. But today I want to warmly welcome Mimi Sheller here from Worcester Polytechnic Institute. And Mimi is an international scholar who has worked mainly within Caribbean studies, mobility research, and social theory. And she has published extensively and made significant research contributions, of course, empirically as well as theoretically. And just to mention some examples, just initiated discussions on the new mobilities paradigm, and together with John Urry, and also established the mobility justice framework, among other things. So in this talk, I think at least that you will focus on related matters to this in relation to sustainable transitions. So Mimi will talk for a maximum 1 hour, and then we will have time for questions and discussions and conversations, hopefully. And to you that are joining online, you are welcome to post questions in the Q&A session. And then we will read them up aloud or ask you to say them yourself. And after the lecture, we will have some refreshments outside here, and hopefully you online can get your own refreshments. And well, that's the setting for today. So without further ado, I want to welcome you, Mimi.
Thank you, Karen.
And we will have to see if this works. Let's try to
There we go.
There we go.
Okay, great to be here. Thank you so much for the invitation from the TEMA group and the the Planning and Transition series. It's a wonderful honor to be part of this series, which with such excellent speakers. And I'm glad to see that you have Peter Cox coming up next. And as you know, I started my career in a way at Lancaster University and the Center for Mobilities Research that I co-founded with John Urry, and over the years have enjoyed the work of many of the people who you'll be featuring in your series through the Center for Mobilities Research. So it all began in a way. I'll just add a biographical note. It's 25 years ago that I started at Lancaster. And very soon after beginning meeting with the late sociologist John Urry, we co-wrote an article called "The City and the Car." It was published in the International Journal of Urban and Regional Research in 2000. And that was the beginning of really thinking about sustainable mobility transitions for me, and sort of what were the factors in what John came to call the system of automobility that were making it very difficult for us to transition away from it. But we were quite hopeful at the time that there were, things moving and happening and changing, and that there would be the emergence of a post-car, post-carbon, sustainable mobility transition. And in a way, the talk I'm going to give today is to sort of reflect a little bit on where we are at right now. And in some ways, it's maybe a little bit pessimistic in terms of looking back at the last 25 years and where we thought we might have been by now. So my talk is called "How Can Sustainable Mobilities Be Made More Just?" And this sort of summarizes the overview of the theme, that really since the beginning of the 21st century, we have seen many efforts to change how people become mobile and also how we understand the larger relationship between mobilities and space, mobilities and societies, mobilities and geographies, or whichever discipline you're coming from. Mobilities have been changing how we think about it. With the dawning awareness of the calamity of the climate crisis, many people have recognized the urgent need to decarbonize our transportation systems. And so I'm putting this in the context of thinking about all of the activists, the designers, the policymakers, the social theorists. Many people have been advocating a sustainable mobility transition for the last 20 years or so. At the same time, we've seen also developments in technology and a kind of proclamation of transportation futurists, what we might call sort of techno-modernists, that these things are happening and these things are coming. That is, that we will have shared electric, connected, autonomous vehicle systems. We will have smart infrastructure. We will have net zero solutions. We've had that promise kind of on the table for many years now. And in both cases, we do see examples of some of these things coming to life. And sociologists and other social theorists, meanwhile, have been theorizing and studying the new patterns of mobilities and immobilities and calling also for greater attention to transportation equity and mobility justice as we go through these purported transitions that are happening. So all in all, you could say that new technologies, new business models, new design concepts, new social science approaches, and even what seems to be a kind of generational shift in the cultural desires of how to move, all seem to be challenging the dominant automobility system that took hold in the 20th century. So then the question is, why are we still living with it, right? Like, why is it so obdurate? Why is it so hard to change? There's many reasons to be skeptical of the sort of optimistic story of transition. And the developments that I've just mentioned that have been promoting sustainability, I'm going to argue, promote it only in a very limited sense if they're not coupled with a critique of wider, what I call kino-political power relations and practices. That is, I'm going to lay out an argument today that effective mobility transitions or sustainable mobility transitions must encompass mobility justice, or they're not going to happen. And in fact, that's why they're not happening. Just our sort of deeper efforts towards mobility justice will call on us to challenge some of the limitations of sustainability transitions, including what I'll talk about throughout the talk as green gentrification. You probably have heard that term, and also to confront climate coloniality. And the claim, which I see you have coming up in one of your later talks, also of the need to decolonize knowledge and our local and global epistemic kind of approaches to thinking about built environments, transport, infrastructure, and the dominant mobility regimes. So that's the broad arc of the talk. So as cities and countries around the world have been facing this question of the transition to sustainable, decarbonized mobilities, generally we find a combination of policies being promoted and kind of circulating to cities around the world, which are, pretty straightforward: to promote active transport, like walking and biking, to improve public transit systems, to seek to reduce automobility through a number of measures such as safer streets, through like a Vision Zero planning, better street design, also the introduction of shared platform mobilities, shared cars, but also shared bikes, e-mobility, micro-mobility. Many cities are obviously implementing these kinds of plans, Vision Zero plans, complete streets plans, also transit-oriented development, all to improve walking and biking infrastructure. And also things like open streets events. And, here you see some of these changes in, there's a New York City bike lane there and shared bike system. And, New York has made great strides in doing that in Manhattan. And also you see an open streets event in Mexico City, which I had the pleasure of participating in one open streets event in Mexico City, which was wonderful when we held a conference there of the International Association for the History of Transport, Traffic, and Mobility. So, all of those events are very helpful and all of those interventions in design in certain cities across Europe and North America, Latin America, that have adopted these interventions to make streets more bike and pedestrian friendly, more active transport friendly. From Bogota to Mexico City and Santiago in Latin America. And then even in some of the mega cities across other parts of Asia and Africa, we're also seeing the more public transit related policies around installing bus rapid transit systems, new subway systems being built, and even things like aerial cable cars, which all of these sort of trends are circulating around the world today. But contrary to all of these hopes, visions, practices of sustainable urban planning and the kind of the utopias promised by some techno-futurists, as well as planners and theorists, there's also a growing realization of these extreme uneven mobilities or mobility injustices. And those are leading in more dystopian directions that I want to talk about a little bit. There are deep patterns of what Stephen Graham and Simon Marvin called splintered urbanism, if you've seen their book of that name. And that is giving some groups access to high mobility or ease of mobility, while at the same time cutting off others or relegating them to more stressful and difficult processes of moving. There are inequities in the overall design of transportation systems and land use that erode some people's capabilities to meet basic needs and to just be able to get around where they're living. And this includes both city centers and city peripheries, but also suburbs and larger regional area developments as well. There are differential mobility regimes governing who can move or not under highly unequal conditions. So in this approach to mobility justice, I talk about how power and inequality are embedded in the governance and control of all forms of mobilities and immobilities and dwelling and infrastructures to support those. And that these differential mobilities and immobilities, which are always entangled with each other, have deep historical roots. And in the book, Mobility Justice, I try to trace some of those histories of patriarchy, colonialism, imperialism, racial capitalism, which kind of lead to our current built environments and can't be ignored completely. I also draw on some recent work in the US by groups who are looking at inequities within especially American mobility regimes. And someone named Charles T. Brown has developed the idea of arrested mobility, which I think is interesting, to refer to the process by which he says with collaborators, the capacity of especially Black people to move freely and safely is limited by poor infrastructure, policy, and planning decisions and police enforcement. And that's true not just for Black populations, but in the US, there's evidence for Black, Indigenous, Latinx populations, immigrants, and undocumented people, all of whom are living in neighborhoods and in places which lack justice. And so I also refer to the work of Julian Agyeman and others who've written about just sustainabilities, and that the inequities that are built into our urban infrastructure and suburban infrastructure are often being reproduced by new sustainability or green transitions. So even placemaking and green infrastructure and what are supposed to be inclusive mobilities often are not paying enough to justice within the vision for sustainable transitions. So I'm going to argue today that the process of driving forward sustainable mobility transitions demand that we center principles of mobility justice, not just because, social justice is a good thing, but also because we will not reach sustainability or social justice unless we combine them together. They have to go hand in hand. And to do that requires a reconfiguration of these wider power relations that I refer to as kino-political. Kino meaning movement, political, the politics of movement, the politics of mobility, but also the mobility of politics is another way to think about that. And those who are living high mobility, energy intensive lives, who I call the kinetic elites, are implicated in producing mobility injustices all of the time. And when I say high mobility lives, I don't just mean that they're the only ones moving. I mean that they control the decision-making, both about their own choices of mobility or to stay in place and have things delivered to them. And they also control the mobilities of others, including the relation to labor and different kinds of workers and who is creating the logistical systems for food and delivery services and all sorts of infrastructural functioning, drivers, energy sector workers. Their mobilities are affected by the kinetic elite as well. So we now have this awareness of mobility injustices and that dominant mobility regimes are driving transitions that are not serving the needs of all people. The mobility system involves interlocking socio-ecological practices, and those are built on things like post-colonial racial regimes that divide the world into different segments, industrial and business networks, which also have a kind of regional and a transnational footprint. Also, geopolitical and military power are part of what underwrites or, upholds the current dominant mobility regimes, and ongoing relations between mobilities, energy production, extractive industries, land use, and displacement. So, well, I began talking about, like the city and the car. The approach to automobility as a system and to the dominant regime very quickly scales up to broader scales of planetary mobilities, as well as down to like the individual micro level personal mobilities. And as I began to argue in 2011, as quoted here, a full transition away from the currently dominant automobility system will only take place when we simultaneously address the issues of social inequality that underpin the unsustainability of the current system. And I'm now more convinced of that than ever, and that there will be no sustainability transition without a kino-political challenge to these kinetic elites, or what you could even call a mobility justice revolution. And that maybe that language sounds a little extreme politically speaking, but it's just a way to sort of really highlight the framing of what needs to happen for a just mobility transition. So let me begin with a little bit of review of the transformation that happened in the social sciences and humanities over the last 2 decades with the emergence of what John Urry and I called the new mobilities paradigm when we first published the first articles about it in 2006. And we were involved in this kind of interdisciplinary way of studying, experimenting with, and transforming mobilities and how we study mobilities. And in the early 2000s, John Urry had published his book, Sociology Beyond Societies, and began to sort of think about the object of study of the social sciences as the mobilities that precede or inform the formation of what we then call societies or nation states or cultures or any entity. Basically, that mobilities come first and that we want to study those mobilities. And in other regards, that was related to work that was emerging, drawing on some of Ulrich Beck's ideas about risk society and Sven Kesselring's development of the idea of mobile risk society as another way to think about that. And then John already did a number of collaborations with others, for example, with Anthony Elliott, looking at different kinds of mobile lives that were shaping how people lived and got around, and beginning to imagine this era called After the Car, which was the name of another book he published. And it was clear during this period in the sort of 2000s and 2010s that some kinetic elites or wealthier people who were able to self-determine their own mobilities were living highly mobile lives, taking advantage of elite mobilities where they had access to a kind of protected cocoons of low-stress travel and multi-locational networking. And it involves both data and information as well as physical mobilities. And that was being accompanied by, as I said, this kind of disadvantage and exclusion of others, as well as the control over their mobilities. And so mobility justice became a way for me to think about that and articulate that in my book of 2018, but also in other work by, for example, Cook and Butts have an edited collection on mobility justice, which also came out in 2018, to really frame these entanglements of power and social exclusion or differentiation in the mobilities of people, but also of things, of data, of ideas, and representations that were informing the differential and unequal access to movement. And also of interest were a whole series of studies by geographers, and I cite Tim Cresswell's work here, like his book On the Move, which also came out in around 2006. But he went on to publish various articles and sort of is working on a book manuscript that are looking at differentiated rhythms and what he calls meso-level theoretical ideas, such as friction and turbulence in mobilities and immobilities, as a way to begin to talk about the dynamic constellations of movement, the meanings of movement, and the embodied mobility practices, using a kind of Lefebvrean three-part way of understanding it. And I think that kind of idea of a rhythm analysis and studying friction and turbulence is a very useful way to sort of get at these differential mobilities at different scales and really think about how to study them, methodologically speaking. And so, summing this little introduction up, we're in a period of many new narratives, technologies, and mobility policies and experiments involving, in some cases, with great optimism about the development of shared digital micromobilities, autonomous, electric, virtual, hybrid, even aerial mobilities. I just visited the little community next to the campus and saw some really interesting examples of that effort to design a kind of new mobility system into the building of a kind of landscaped environment, let's say, a new kind of streetscape and a new kind of living space. And it's really interesting to see the efforts to bring that to life, as well as the possible failures or limitations of those efforts. And I think we're seeing that in many cities, that despite a lot of this optimism and activity, beyond the excitement and the hype, we also know this is a period of multiple mobility injustices. And I referred to arrested mobilities. We could think about disrupted mobilities in terms of whose journeys are stopped. Of course, we all went through the disruption of the COVID pandemic and saw how that extremely impacted mobilities. But there's also other ways to think about carceral mobilities and forced mobilities and displacement, as well as detention, imprisonments, evictions, homelessness, the eviction of camps of people who are experiencing homelessness. There's many sort of dystopian mobilities happening that are unsustainable and ultimately, in some cases, deadly mobilities, because we see both in the United States, the policing of mobilities, which has led to stop and frisk policies, as well as arrest of drivers, which have sparked police shootings in many cases that led to the Black Lives Matter movement and the sort of claim that just being able to move freely can end up in people being killed. And the same goes on when we talk about borders and transnational mobilities, the deaths at sea, the deaths in the desert on the US-Mexican border, because of what is happening in these transitions that are going on right now. So how do we make sense of these tensions and shifting currents in mobility futures? And what kinds of new mobilities are actually emerging, like beyond the totally utopian and the totally dystopian? What's happening? What economic forces and social practices and contested politics are shaping the emergence of these future mobilities? And how are they shaping the sustainability of our planetary future? So I'm going to give a few statistical charts here. Let's see if I can help point to these. So while mobility has been improving in some ways, there's also some drastic problems in what's been the recent trends. In the United States, we have a chart here showing annual US pedestrian fatalities, that is struck by cars and motor vehicles. From 1980, you'll see it was around 8,000 and fell down to 4,000 in 2010, and then has climbed steeply back at an even quicker rate to that level. And part of that happened, you'll see a really steep climb during the COVID lockdowns. Why? Because you would think people were traveling less. But what happened was as traffic came off of the streets were emptier and people drove faster. And they were less aware of like what was in the streets around them. And that's partly contributed to a steep rise in both pedestrian and bicyclist fatalities during the pandemic. And it's still high, right? It's come down a little bit, but what we're seeing also is that, well, overall, in car crashes in the United States, there have been year-on-year increases, and right now it's an estimated close to 43,000 people die in car crashes annually in the United States. And globally, that number is 1.3 million people, by the way. But even in my own region, in Boston, Massachusetts, between 2021 and 2022, we had a 35% increase in pedestrian deaths. So this is like a very alarming trend. And when you dig into the numbers, it turns out that more than half of the most dangerous roads, like that have the highest injury, what we call injury network, are in predominantly Black and Latinx neighborhoods. All of the most dangerous high volume arterial roads in the country are in minoritized, racialized neighborhoods. And it's a combination of the speed of the roads, the design of the roads, and also the fact that people who don't have access to good transportation may be walking or bicycling on those roads under poor conditions. So that's one negative trend. You might recognize this other trend map on the right, global fossil fuel consumption. 1800, 1850, 1900, 1950, up to 2023. You see coal at the blue, oil in red, gas, natural gas in green. So for all the sort of activity and stuff we're doing and efforts to sort of bring a sustainable mobility transition, we're going in the wrong direction. We're not getting there. I mean, this is oil for all uses, but we know that a larger and larger proportion of our use of oil is in Europe and in North America is for transportation. As we've made buildings a bit more energy efficient, we're bringing down the percent of that usage that's due to heating and buildings, and more increasing percentage of it is transportation related. So despite our best efforts, we're not reducing our use of fossil fuel quickly enough. Here's another trend map on US statistics again, because the US is like an extreme in some ways, outlier compared to Europe and other industrialized countries. Licensed drivers is the green line. Vehicle registrations is the purple line. Vehicle miles traveled is the blue line, and population is the red line. So you see these interesting trends there, that where there was a brief dip in 2007 to 2012 or so, where fewer people got driver's licenses, fewer people bought vehicles and became registered drivers. And it seemed like it was leveling off. And that was happening right when some of these new sustainable mobility policies were being implemented, and sort of car sharing and bike sharing. And everyone thought, it's working. And even I, for a time, thought, oh my gosh, look, we've brought down VMT, we've brought down licensed drivers. These teenagers today don't want cars, they don't want to drive. Well, the recession ended, people got jobs, they got a little more money in their pockets, and they went right back to driving and living in suburbs. So actually we've had what was at that period what people said, oh, people want to live in city centers and it's walkable or whatever, but they couldn't afford it also. And so they made this choice to suburbs have basically continued to grow in the US, suburbs that don't have very good public transit. And so that young generation that briefly tried living in cities and walking and bicycling, the bulk of them re-suburbanized and automobilized themselves. Of course, you see the other huge dip when COVID began, that blue line of vehicle miles traveled plummeted. But you'll also see it steeply rising back up. And we've gone right back up to as high a level as ever. So, we're not seeing the kinds of transformations we had hoped for. And we're also seeing great global inequality, right? Both in terms of the impacts of the mobilities of the global north on the global south, but also the continued growth in global air travel demand, which again, after the stop in the pandemic, has gone right back up. And by 2023, globally, air traffic was back at 94.1% of pre-pandemic levels of 2019. So there's also huge global mobility impacts besides what's happening within our cities. And so that's the sort of negative trends. So let me talk about why mobility justice is so important for getting, to understand this. And a number of social movements have emerged and sort of activist networks, like this group called People for Mobility Justice, which was linked to a collective called the Untokening, which developed what they called principles of mobility justice. At the same time that I was working on my book, Mobility Justice, and which I talk about in the introduction to the book, I became aware that this group existed. And I was like, wow, that's so interesting that there's people actually forming an organization to advocate for mobility justice. It's not just a theoretical idea. And what they were arguing was that historical disenfranchisement, disinvestment in neighborhoods, and disproportionate exposure of people of color and what they call Black, Indigenous, and people of color or BIPOC populations in the United States are exposed to pollution, to repressive policing, and negative impacts on their health, on their wealth, on their mobility, and their security. And so they said that mobility justice demands that we recognize and reconcile the historical and current injustices being experienced by those communities. So, this was, for me, an important way to begin thinking about what would it look like to have policies that actually included greater mobility justice. And one place where you thought you might begin to see that was in what was called the Green New Deal proposals that were being floated in the United States, a little bit similar to the Green Deal, I believe, in Europe, which tried to sort of embrace a lot of social equity and labor-based policies along with the sustainable transition policies. And part of those sort of radical critique that was embedded in some of this thinking was the idea also that the global fossil fuel regime is related to the accumulation of what Andreas Malm called fossil capital, right? And that there's this world historical system of fossil imperialism that basically controlled and still controls the flow of cheap fossil energy, and that energy transitions to renewable energy sources will not really be effective in a sustainability transition unless they also address that underlying system of coloniality and carbon imperialism on which it was founded. So I'm going to talk a little about a new edited collection that I've contributed just the afterword to, but it's edited by Farhana Sultana. It's called Confronting Climate Coloniality. And the argument of some of the contributors to that book are that a transformation of the energy system that only transforms like the technical components, like, oh, well, we'll replace fossil fuel with renewable energy and then everything will be okay, doesn't address the underlying socio-political dynamics that have shaped these uneven distribution of the benefits and costs of our energy production and consumption. And so it will lead to continued, if not greater, injustice. And there are grassroots struggles that are critical of things like the Green New Deal and of the urban planning and transport planning and industrial planning that go along with them, because they don't recognize the deeper historical contexts of racialization and colonialism that are still there in the new green transition policies. So this idea of a green gentrification, for example, which is, the phenomenon where the racialized or minoritized lower socioeconomic status neighborhoods are displaced and often unhoused, unable to afford housing, while new low carbon infrastructure is built in those neighborhoods that benefits what in the US are largely white, urban, and suburban upper middle classes. So it's a racial and class analysis of how green transportation policies are actually displacing many neighborhoods, and we call that green gentrification. So when you install what are sometimes called placemaking features, like green amenities and little pocket parks and bike lanes and pedestrian zones and things like that, in many North American and European cities, it's contributed to pushing out insecure renters who are forced to move to more affordable neighborhoods. And those neighborhoods also turn out to have poorer mobility options, as well as often being burdened with environmental pollution, as well as transportation inequities. And you probably have seen protest movements against some of these things. So even, for example, the Barcelona superblocks, there's a lot of critique happened around whether they were still going to have enough affordable housing for people to stay in those neighborhoods that had been improved with these wonderful superblocks. And in the United States, we have constant pushback against bike lanes and the creation of protected bike lanes, more than just like paint on the ground. But the pushback comes from partly businesses who say they'll lose traffic coming through, but also neighborhoods that see those lanes as forcing them out of their neighborhood and bringing in newcomers, bringing in people because the prices are going to go up. The other big force is around climate coloniality. And that's where low carbon energy transitions are premised on extractive sacrifice zones in rural and often indigenous communities, more remote communities where mining is taking place for the electric transition, right? So we know the mining of lithium, cobalt, bauxite, rare earths, which are necessary to build new electric infrastructures, to create batteries, all of these things are also, again, displacing people, polluting air and water and agricultural land or taking it. And so I draw here on some work by Manisha Anantharaman, which is in this book on confronting climate coloniality, who shows how policies for decarbonization and building green infrastructure reinscribe colonial relations if they fail to really reduce the overconsumption of energy and resources by the kinetic elite or by the global north, more broadly speaking. So Anand Saram argues that green infrastructure will continue to serve privatized consumption to colonize urban hinterlands, to dump waste, and to enclose urban commons for real estate development. If we're not more careful and more aware about the mobility justice implications of these policies and these efforts. Let's see. And the other aspect I wanted to mention too was that as we install more renewable energy infrastructure, we're also seeing huge growth in the use of that renewable energy to power things like private electric SUVs and trucks, which are very big, very heavy, that the US car industry has embraced, like the Ford F-150, electric version that weighs, I think, 2 tons. But we're also seeing massive energy use for things like Bitcoin mining and increasingly artificial intelligence and the data servers. You'll see huge growth in the energy demands, which are shown here, which have gone from a sort of 2-year doubling of computing power used in training AI systems to an even more steeper 3.4-month doubling. And it's probably, I don't know, this was when it was created, but it's probably, this is from OpenAI. It's massively rapid energy consumption. So the more renewable energy we bring online, the more we end up using. And this is something in economics, which is called the Jevons paradox, which occurs when technological progress increases the efficiency with which a resource is used, reducing the amount necessary for any one use. Like we see the cost of solar panels falling, the cost of wind power becoming more affordable, but the falling cost of use induces increases in demand enough that resource use is actually increased rather than reduced. So the more affordable we make renewable energy, the more we find these crazy ways of using it up. And not only will AI technologies continue to consume increasing amounts of renewable energy rather than us using it to replace existing fossil fuel consumption, but these new appropriations of renewable energy are also driving what you could think of as a financialization of the last remaining commons on Earth to benefit basically private entities. So they're taking the atmosphere, they're taking water sources, they're taking, hydropower, rivers, or, the land that is still being used that has not been enclosed is now being used for renewable energy production. So all of these critiques of the current unsustainable mobility transition lead to an awareness of the significance of the local and global kinopolitical struggles for mobility justice around the world. And that is partly what led me to start thinking about the idea of commoning in mobilities research. And I end the book Mobility Justice with some preliminary thoughts about the idea of mobile commoning and the mobile commons and different ways of thinking about it. It's ideas I've been working on a little more since then. I've published a couple of articles on mobile commoning. But in very broad strokes, we could go back to the 1970s when Ivan Illich noted that the road has been degraded from a commons to a simple resource for the circulation of vehicles. And Illich talked about going at the speed of a bicycle, and that we would have a more just and democratic society if we were going at the speed of a bicycle, because that would not appropriate the commons of the road in the same way. But the notion of commoning mobility has also been adopted by scholars like Anna Nikolaeva, who along with Pete Adey and Tim Cresswell and some others have done some works on articles on commoning mobility, arguing that we need to theorize mobility as commons and articulate a new politics of mobility transition, because the commons lens, they say, can help us envision more inclusive and collaboratively governed cities. And beyond the individual right to move, they call for a focus on how collective social needs are mediated through mobilities. This might mean access to shared vehicles, or reducing energy consumption for the common good, or producing shared spaces of communal access, all of which we see in the interesting community near here. And so my take on commonings is slightly more of a political take, that it's not just inclusively and collaboratively governed, but to ask some more tough questions about this sort of kino-political struggle and how will this actually take place. So I'm just going to conclude with a few quick examples of some kinds of mobile commoning that are taking place. So first of all, you could say mobile commoning begins at the embodied, personal, and local scale. I'm going to talk about it at different scales, in which people learn to be mobile with others. And when we're mobile with others, there's an argument, and I think you'll hear this from Peter Cox when he visits next month, that there's an ethics of care that happens when we're mobile together. That is, we know that we try not to crash into each other. We try not to run each other over. And in some cases, we try to also not have too violent an impact on the more than human world as we're being mobile. And that is the idea that we need to protect human and more than human mobility potentials. And that might mean we have to self-regulate our own excessive mobilities, limit our unnecessary speed, possibly take issue with those who are abusing the free space or the commons of the road, maybe pricing the externalities of transportation, preventing the harms that are caused by whether it's fossil fuel extractive industries or renewable energy extractive industries. All of those things would be part of a sort of kino-political struggle, but it begins with examples like this group called Slow Roll Chicago, which I talk about a little bit in the book, but community-based organizations for mobility justice take this form in the United States. This was co-founded by Jamal Julian and Obai Reed in 2014. And Slow Roll builds on community bicycling events to advocate racial equity, increased mobility, and racial justice, as they say, to make lives better for Black, Brown, and Indigenous people of color across the United States. And they claim to mobilize cycling not just as transportation, but as a tool to build community health, cohesion, and jobs, and both physical and mental health, which they also argue will help build trust and counter urban violence. So Slow Roll Chicago makes a point of bringing together otherwise fragmented communities in casual, slow cycling events that purposely de-emphasize cycling as transportation. Reed explains that it's a ritual of social cohesion, and people move together in public space, they share stories, improve their health, rebuild community trust, and help counter violence in their neighborhoods. He says, we ride bikes to make our neighborhoods better. He has a new organization now called Equiticity, if you want to read more and follow up on how that's going. Let me now give another example at a very different scale. We can also think about kino-political movements that are challenging the larger scale mobility injustices that are degrading the commons, such as protests against mining. So low carbon energy transitions premised on extractive sacrifice zones, which are continuing to impact rural and indigenous communities, as I was mentioning. Those protests are happening across Latin America, parts of Asia, but even here in Europe, this is Portugal, protests against lithium mine, and Serbia. You may have heard there are huge protests happening this month in Belgrade against a Rio Tinto lithium mine on prime agricultural land in Serbia. It's a key part of European transition strategies to have this kind of lithium sovereignty, have its own lithium, so we're not dependent on other parts of the world. But this is a kinopolitical struggle because the people who will be affected are not the ones who will benefit from the mining. So there's an argument that large-scale climate adaptation projects and climate mitigation, low carbon projects, which currently dominate the economy of climate interventions, this is according to Joshua Long, again, in this book edited by Sultana, they frequently displace or degrade marginalized communities and their ecosystems. And that, he argues, requires us to decolonize climate and undo what others have called the coloniality of power through just transitions that will not further pollute, displace, and dispossess these communities. So at a planetary scale, there are projects now, for example, space exploration, deep sea mining, and also the creation of carbon markets around the world, which are furthering the frontiers of extraction through a false narrative of terra nullius, or empty land, empty ground, empty earth, the deep sea, nobody bothered with it before, but now we're going to mine it. And there are these new enclosures happening of land, water, forest, deep ocean, and outer space, which are continuing the same environmental violence and ecocide that we've seen in the past. So finally, these deeper kinopolitical transformations that confront climate coloniality must be grounded in more what some call pluriversal political ontologies. And that means challenging the assumption that more mobility is always a social good. So it's not just a distributive justice claim, like, oh, well, we all need more mobility, but that we need also to recognize reparative justice in these uneven systems of energy production and consumption that have contributed to the current climate crisis and environmental crisis and social crisis. And to reframe kinopolitical transformations means not just decarbonizing transportation, but actually critiquing this overconsumption of energy within capitalist extractive economies and arguing for the repayment of climate debt or climate reparations that is owed by the global north. As well as a critical analysis of emerging forms of climate apartheid, where some people are ending up in more livable, survivable places, where others are pushed to ever more high risk, high hazard places. So in conclusion, I call for limiting the impacts of our mobilities on others and thinking about a kind of rhythm analysis of how we might synchronize our mobilities and our energy use with the needs of the natural world or the more than human world. Part of that means recognizing these harm and ongoing mobility inequities and the need for reparations and payment of loss and damages. Also, it means shifting planning power away from kinetic elites and carbon capital or extractive capital through some kind of democratization and decolonization of decision-making and planning, restraining the overconsumption of energy and excessive travel by kinetic elites, which include many academics. Seems like European universities have been a little better at putting those caps on travel, which American universities have not really done yet. Create rules for commenting and promoting an ethics of careful mobilities or caring mobilities and seeing what we can learn about how those are already happening and how already being practiced. And finally, reduce the sort of harms, inequities, and injustices of mobilities through these various forms of mobile commenting that I've just started to touch upon a little bit. So I want to stop there so we have time for questions and discussion. And thank you for being here.
Thank you so much, Mimi. Maybe we should stop the sharing the screen sharing so we can maybe the people online can see us a little bit. Yeah, that's nice. Do we have any questions or comments? We can start in the room maybe and see if we have any questions. No one? I think there could be a lot of questions.
Could start on that.
Yes, we can.
Yeah, so one question is, what do you mean with Black people having a lower capacity to mobility? And how do you think about the justice in using slave labor to extract minerals for electric mobility?
Yeah. Yeah, so it's interesting to maybe, I don't know the exact translation between the words capacity and capabilities and how that works in Swedish, but within theories of justice, there's the capabilities approach developed by Amartya Sen and Martha Nussbaum. And so sometimes, while I might use the word capacities, it's in reference to a larger framing within a capabilities approach to justice, which is one way to think about how are people able to meet their needs. And being mobile is one basic human need, but also capabilities to, have food and shelter, clean water, clean air, health, education, various kinds of welfare, or what in Latin America they call bien vivir. So, or what buen vivir, I don't know if I'm pronouncing it right, but like, a good life, a good way of living. And that's what is being undermined by many of these inequitable mobility regimes or dominant mobility systems at many different scales. And so the idea that certain people don't have capabilities references that part of it where their environment has taken away certain aspects of justice and the capabilities framework. But as I think the question alludes to also, that there are also many forms of forced or coerced mobilities or forced or coerced displacement or forced labor of different kinds, of trafficking of different kinds. There's many illegal, illicit, and coercive mobilities in the world today. And so when I speak of justice and mobilities, it is not, as I said, it's not just that, okay, everybody has the right to move, because some people are moving a lot, but it's not under their own self-determination. And so people also need the capability to stay in place, to dwell somewhere, and to not have their surroundings degraded completely, or to be forced to do certain kinds of work in order to stay in a place. And many populations now also like temporarily move somewhere to work and then live in a way somewhere else temporarily, or their family lives somewhere else, where they're sending money home, remittances, or they're, spending a little bit of time. In fact, when I arrived here in Stockholm, I met a taxi driver who was from Iraq, and he said he works here for 3 weeks, and then he goes for a week, not back to Iraq, because he can't really go back to Iraq, but to Morocco, and lives there in Morocco, and then comes back here to work. So there's many, many different patterns of these mobility fixes that people are sort of working with, at the same time that, of course, capital investment is also constantly doing, spatiotemporal fixes of mobilities as well. So I'm not sure if that's what the questioner was getting at exactly, but
looks like you want to say something about this. No.
Yes, I will ask a question, but I actually
But then I can ask a question in the meanwhile. So I was just curious, like, what would you answer if someone would say that this claim to include also justice into the transition, if that, I guess one claim is that would then hamper or like make the sustainable transition slower and also increase climate change that. So what would you answer someone saying like, but is not climate the most important question, and how should we take justice later, or like how can we answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that goes back to the initial premise of my argument, which is that we're not transitioning. Like whatever you might think you're doing that you think is helping climate, you're not reaching the right depth of transformation. And I think the justice argument, in some ways, I mean, I haven't talked exactly about how to operationalize that in a political sense. That's a harder question, but it will foster a deeper, more transformative contribution to reducing our fossil fuel and greenhouse gases. So it's like, if you really want that to happen, the argument is that you need to do this harder work at the political level, the kinopolitical level, to make the transition you want actually happen. Because what we're doing now is not making it happen based on all those statistics and charts and increasing fossil fuel use and increasing extractive industries for electric and increasing inequalities. And it's not good enough if some people live in a bubble of clean, green transportation and good air and water, and the rest of the world be damned.
Should we take one from online?
Take turns online and offline questions. So Bradley Rick asks, says, thanks for your thought-provoking talk, Mimi, regarding an ethics of mobilities care. Much of our work here in South Africa in shared mobility practices, minibus, taxis, and buses, demonstrates complex ethics of care that are in place every day. So the question then is, how can we extend that learning to influence more elite mobility practices?
Oh, yeah.
Examples too.
Thank you. And hi, Bradley. We know each other. Good to have you here. And yes, I mean, I think one of the things I want to sort of think about, and I hope many people are thinking about, are where are these caring practices already happening, already flourishing? We already see them. And one of those places is in informal transportation, where people who need to get somewhere to function in their lives, but don't have access to good public transit, don't have automobility, they are already creating informal transportation networks. And often those are collective, and they come up with the kind of rules for sharing and accessing those collective transport means. And I'm actually on the advisory board of a group called the Global Network for Informal Transportation. And it's created partly by an organization called the Shared Use Mobility Center. And it works closely with, if you know ITDP, which is an international transportation and development, oh my goodness, I forget, policy institute, I think, to work at the level of some of the cities in the world that are trying to implement sustainable mobility policies and trying to decarbonize, and maybe are investing in public transit systems. In some cases, they're excluding the already existing informal transportation providers because they see them as kind of illegal and backward and polluting, and they're going to build this clean, new, great, bus rapid transit system or underground subway system. And the argument of the global network is that actually informal transportation is really, really crucial to how the majority of the world actually get around, and we need to pay more attention to it, and that policymakers from the global north have not always recognized the importance of informal transport in the global south, although it also occurs in the global north too, in some of these like mega cities, and that we need to look at how those groups are already organizing collective transport. In particular, how is it reaching women, the elderly, children, people in peripheral neighborhoods, kind of marginalized areas in ways that could be more sustainably implemented or integrated into the system of transition planning. And so one area in which that's happening, for example, is moto taxis in many African cities have started to convert to electric motors, electric moto taxis. That would be one way to recognize not just the users of the transportation, but actually also the drivers and the labor of driving as an important constituency to engage in sustainable mobility transitions. And Bradley, of course, has done great work on buses and on there's actually also a special issue I contributed to on public transit as a public space, and thinking about like what kinds of commoning and care are happening in the public spaces of transit are another great way to look at how are people using those spaces and how are they using it to care for others. And I think we can build on those practices as well.
Right. I don't know either how to phrase this question or comment or reflection, but we were talking during the coffee break about the teaching and different experiences. So I was wondering how you may not have an answer, but how we as teachers can relate to the pessimism of the development and how we teach about transition without like navigating between hope and despair or hope and pessimism. Is that something that you've talked about or?
Yeah, it's funny because well, I don't know, funny, but because I'm currently at a tech school, a STEM focused, Polytechnic, many of our students actually believe in technological solutions, and they believe that we can, invent our way, innovate our way towards a better future, which is a little different than maybe students who have maybe been more attracted to critical, social sciences or humanities, who I think maybe are feeling more despair, possibly. And so what we try to do with our tech students is to introduce them to people of different places and different life experiences and different cultures, and try to have them understand that technology has to be co-designed and co-produced in an ethical way with people and particular environments, particular like constellations or assemblages. Actor network theory could come in here to sort of just think about like the people and the technologies and the place and the environment and how does it all come together, so that they learn a little bit more humility, humbleness in their drive for technological solutions. So I know that's different than your question, but that's the one we deal with more from the point of view of like despair of the sort of generation. I'm actually seeing, in some cases, the despair turn to anger, right? Anger at the older generation for having messed things up so badly and having not done anything about it, even though we knew. And so that can be a productive anger if it drives more radical efforts towards social change. And I think opens people's eyes to sort of really ask hard questions about the prevailing liberal green presumptions of what we need to be doing and like, is it working? So I hope the kids will ask us hard questions and not just like give up in despair, but get mad at us.
Do we have any more online questions? No. Do we have any other questions in the room? No, we start with Marcus, maybe over there, or okay, Marcus, sorry.
Yes. Okay, yeah, so my question sort of connects to the comments a little bit. I was thinking about in relation to this trend of green gentrification that you were talking about. I spent very briefly, but to be very quick, I spent some time following some movements in Atlanta, Georgia, like to that project, which was very much along these lines, kind of walkable trail around the city, which had produced a lot of kind of displacement pressure, especially sort of Black or inner city residents. But then, in relation to this, was also a movement which tried to promote the construction of a light rail loop on this walkable trail to sort of take the city away from a very like extremely car dependent mobility system and so on. And I attended some of the meetings and talked to some of the persons in this kind of social movement basically, and they were very aware of what the kind of ongoing projects meant with regards to changing demographics and displacement pressure and so on. They still saw the light rail project as like a pathway for creating something else. And I think what I wanted to ask you was like, well, for them, it was very frustrating, I think, to basically be told that whatever you do is wrong. Right? And I think they kind of admitted that, well, we know that this displacement pressure is ongoing, but we still want to see take the opportunity because we have to make like a different kind of mobility system here, and the other, what's going on with kind of circulation capital and revival because of real estate construction, higher housing prices, and so on. We kind of affect it. How could we talk to such a group? What can we tell them that it's not just basically we can't do that? I think this is the same as students. And I am not somebody who I very firmly believe that the point is just a political question. I mean, academics can't solve everything, absolutely not, but still you get this frustration. So, I'm sure you maybe have people who will say this. What would you tell them?
Yeah. Yeah. So, I mean, it's interesting. One of the early discussions around transit inequity in the United States. Well, I mean, you can go back to, slavery and 19th century or whatever, but say in the 20th century, in the civil rights movement and the efforts at desegregating transportation. But then you come to, in the slightly later period, this question of transit justice in Los Angeles, which Tim Cresswell wrote about the LA Bus Riders Union. And there it was a case of investment in a suburban oriented light rail system, which was taking away potential investment in the inner city bus system. And that is a particular history of a particular point in time. And there's still debates like that happening. And, in Philadelphia, where I come from and lived for a long time, there had been plans for a light rail system that would go from the city center out to a big suburban kind of office park and shopping center area called King of Prussia, where a lot of new housing is being built. It was supposed to be a big economic driver for the region and reduce car dependence. But it's been protested against because of the need for investment in the bus systems in more of the inner city or closer in peripheral areas. So that's really different than what you're talking about in Atlanta. And what you see is there's different spatial and social configurations or constellations in different cities and in regions. And so the key point would be to, I think, listen to the voices of the people who are involved at the local level and try to understand how their political view could be incorporated into the planning and thinking. And I mean, one of the key points in the US context and in some parts of Europe would be the protection of affordable housing, wherever a transit development is being planned, if you protect affordable housing, rent caps and so on, and existing neighborhoods that they can sort of still live there, that will make a huge difference in the political question of transit development. And that's obviously it's a state intervention into a market, and they're largely private real estate markets that are driving these developments. And yet we know that the state subsidizes road building and subsidizes the automobility system. And so there's a big debate to be had about to what extent should we be subsidizing more transit-oriented affordable housing hubs. I don't know if that answers that particular question in Atlanta, but yeah.
Yeah, no, I would like to follow up a little on this, but first, many thanks for this very comprehensive, insightful touching.
Thank you.
So, it made me realize a lot of the specificities of mobility justice of the questions, like, for example, that people can network based on this text-paid aviation infrastructure, for example, which is something specific, I think, to the mobility. Also that aspect that I found very insightful, that the speed of your mobility actually depend, I mean, the impact that you might have depends on the speed, etc. So these are specificities that really relate to being mobile. At the same time, there's so many parallels to me trying to understand energy justice, but then there's housing and there might be food. So the question that emerges is, to what extent would it make sense to think of all those interconnections and maybe also to the commonalities? Because in all those fields, I see the only solution that people come up with is commoning in all those fields. and that's kind of the parallel across those fields. And then there's a lot of interconnection. And then the question is then, to what extent do we need to think of mobility justice and energy justice and food justice? And to what extent can we benefit from a trans field, trans need perspective?
Yeah, and it's funny because as in the field of mobility studies or the new mobilities paradigm, I'm one of the very first critiques, almost from the moment it was born, was if mobility is everything, then mobility is nothing. Like, why use a mobility lens? Because everything is mobility, and so where does that get you? And you're actually asking for an even bigger, take on it. Like, okay, it's energy, food, mobility, all of it. And it's true that in thinking about mobile commoning, one way to think about it is as a moving practice of different kinds of commoning, different moments in time for different groups of people in different places. And so commoning of energy or commoning of food is a mobile commons as it kind of moves around. And so I'm on board with that claim. I might still use the word mobile commoning to describe it, even though it's a commoning of many different things. But it's like that we look at ourselves as moving entities in relational formations with human and more than human ecologies, and that is what the basis of human life is. And so if we want sustainable human lives, we shouldn't be in an ontological way, like breaking up the world into our traditional fields. Like, okay, you work on transportation and you work on urban planning and you work on food and agriculture and you work on migration. That's a whole different question. It's like, no, actually those are one thing if you approach it differently. But then how do we organize our thinking, our education, the kinds of conversations we have, who we're talking to actually make that active in the world, activate it is a question. And I think some people here and at other universities are looking at things like creative practice and artistic interventions into how we talk and work together. And more processual understandings of like temporal unfoldings. So a lot of different like philosophical approaches kind of come into play, many of which, to my mind, are mobile and and mobilities is still helps think about a lot of those connections.
Thank you. More questions online or in the room? Yes, Rob.
I wanted to ask if, I'm thinking, you showed several pictures of like dockless scooters and some other recent developments. Do you think there are any like particular developments in recent years, such as, for instance, these kinds of like private interventions in the city, so like Uber or dockless scooters? Do these require like new theorizations of mobility politics, or is there something there you think we don't? I mean, your work and that your colleagues has done so much to kind of contribute to critical transportation studies to make it more like transportation studies more like the rest of critical urban studies, which is really great but do you think there's anything here, like any developments that are yet to be kind of explored in depth or need to be better theorized?
Yeah. So yeah, it's interesting. I've been invited to speak at the New Mobility Congress, which is taking place in Poland, which I will do remotely. I'm not going to travel too much, but and one of the things in the New Mobility Congress is a lot of people and businesses and tech companies that are coming up with these mobility as a service platforms. And that, for a decade or whatever has been really discussed and implemented, experimented with. I think in all those like real world cases, we've seen a lot of frictions in the implementation of those systems and different efforts to represent the needs of different users of the street space. And of course, here it is useful to think of the street space itself as a commons of some kind. And we have let companies come in and in a way create their own enclosures through their business practice of that commons by, putting their electric scooters all over the place. And it turned out people just leave them everywhere and they block sidewalks and pavements and, a lot of people have complained about them, and in some cities they've actually been banned and pushed out. Same thing with car ride-hailing services. Is we've seen ride-hailing like take over not just taxi service in a way, but also replace public transit use. And there's a lot of data in the U.S. which shows public transit users are choosing ride-hailing services instead, where they can afford it and have that economic choice. So and there's evidence that it actually increases to more driving, right? More automobility. And same automated vehicles, same problem. It seems that the way automated vehicles are being implemented in some contexts, certainly in the US, is as almost a ride hail or almost like a private use vehicle that is not collectivized in any way. And so those are all problems that I think we need to be theorizing more. And I think these Cresswell's meso-level theoretical ideas could be an interesting way to think about that. So both the friction of different mobilities and the turbulence that it causes. Like, so when you put a fleet of a new kind of vehicle into an urban context, what turbulence does it cause in the existing system? And then friction is both a positive and a negative. So like he talks about how we need a certain amount of friction to move, because like like a rubber on a road kind of gives you a certain degree of friction that lets you move, but not slide too quickly like you would on ice. So friction enables mobilities, but also can get to the point of totally stopping or slowing them down. And so when we think about the accelerations and decelerations of these different modalities in an urban fabric, we need to think about those aspects of friction and turbulent disruptions. And then, yeah, I think the other question there would also be to what extent those things reach beyond the city center. So again, we have these overprivileged, gentrifying city centers that will have all of these rich mobility options. But what about all the surrounding areas and the people who are still very car dependent in many of those places?
So we have a little bit more time, but no more questions. Well, maybe I can pose one last question.
Okay.
So, talking about operationalizing these ideas. So, what would you say is the role of us as researchers to make these ideas going into policy, being like operationalized more?
Yeah, and I mean, for me, I think one of the most interesting developments I see happening is academic researchers and university teams and research funding agencies encouraging researchers to work more closely in an integrative way with government agencies, with planners, with community organizations, and to sort of embed knowledge into what you might call knowledge action networks, where there's a kind of co-learning process happening, and it's hard to implement, slow, doesn't always work, you know, whatever, different expectations, different timelines. It's not easy, but I think working through some of those networked relationships is at least a way to begin to figure out how we can move forward together. How can the knowledge networks and the governance and planning and social movement activist networks all start to bring together their different types of knowledge and know-how and different build a sort of new kinds of decision-making and planning efforts. I mean, I think that's maybe a little abstract. In a more like concrete way, there's big ideas like participatory budgeting or something like that, where citizens have direct input on how tax money gets spent. There are big differences, of course, between democratic political contexts and non-democratic contexts. And so that's a whole nother level of question there. But I'm saying like within a sort of democratic presumption.
Thank you so much. And thank you to everyone participating online and here in the room. And now I will run and get some refreshments so we can have that outside here.
Thank you.
Thank you so much, Mimi, for joining us.
Thanks for great questions.